Dear guests, welcome to the Gender Equity session of Ashoka Changemakers Summit, also known as ACMS. ACMS is Ashoka's largest gathering of its global community of changemakers, where we hold space for stimulating conversations on critical issues such as gender equity, climate change, technology, aging, and many more. My name is Zeynep Meydanoğlu Ertan, and I co-lead the Ashoka Turkey office, as well as the Next Now gender field and community. I will be your facilitator today. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. If you have any questions or comments throughout the conversation, feel free to drop them in the chat box, which should appear at the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. My colleagues will collect them and we will discuss them towards the end of our time together. Second announcement, our 45-minute conversation will be followed by a Community Connect session where you are invited to meet like-minded, like-hearted people passionate about gender equity. You will find the Zoom link also in the chat box towards the end of our session. During our conversation today, we will pursue some interesting questions. We will ask what insights from the feminist and queer movements can bring our definitions of success and system change to the next level. What are some of the roles, rules, resources, relationships these movements have managed to shift so that the systems they work at produce better results for everyone? And how is it possible to bring about system and mindset shifts doing the deep work that is needed? We will embark on this journey with three extraordinary changemakers. Tarık Zeydan, leader of HELEM, the leading LGBTQ rights organization in the Arab world, is joining us from Beirut, Lebanon. Welcome, Tarık.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
We also have with us Aditi Gera, a young changemaker and Power of Empowered, which helps underprivileged girls through a mentorship program in rural India. Aditi, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And last but not least, we have Tatiana Fraser, hailing from Canada, co-founder of Systems Sanctuary, which is a peer learning platform for systems leadership. So let's dive right in. And Tatiana, I want to start with you. I want to ask you, what can feminist practice teach us about system change? And I know you literally wrote the book on it, so it feels weird asking you to explain it in a few minutes' time. But really, what is there to learn from the feminist movement, and how, in your opinion, system change practices and feminist practices can align and nourish each other?
Lovely, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Thanks everyone for joining us. So to answer that question, just a little bit of context. I spent many years, and my background has been at the intersection of systems change and gender issues and social justice. I co-founded an organization called Girls Action Foundation, and we worked for many years to support the leadership and empowerment of girls and young women and social justice. And when I stepped away from that work, I was very preoccupied with systems change in this emerging field and of practice. I knew that we were doing systems change in a feminist, intersectional, kind of social justice context. But I was grappling with how do we frame this? How do we communicate it? How do we talk about it? And so I went on a learning journey with other leaders in Canada to look and inquire into the edges of systems change. And very clearly, what I saw is that systems practice and systems change aligns with feminist intention. And so when we think about systems change, we're looking to shift systems from outdated ways of being, from outdated mindsets and approaches to much more relational approaches, to collaborative ways of working, to new ways of being, in order to shift those systems. And in a feminist context, we're working, from my perspective, is that we're working to shift kind of violent systems, hierarchical systems that are still rooted in dominance and violence, to much more collaborative, life-affirming ways of being in the world. So in these ways, we see an alignment. But what I found over time is that there was a gap in the systems change kind of approaches, which value relational practices. Like it's where relationships happen is where the change happens, which is I agree with that. But often in systems practice, we're missing kind of a critical power analysis. And so in the systems work that I was doing with feminist movements and organizations and collaborations, we saw that a power analysis was critical. And in fact, the feminist practices of centering first voice, centering lived experience, centering healing, working at the grassroots level, that this work was what we call the deep root systems work, was critical in order to actually be able to shift power and shift systems. And so a lot of the feminist practice that we outline in our work, critical power analysis, intersectional approaches, healing-centered work, and centering lived experience, these practices complement and support actual systems change work. So we can learn from those practices, from feminist work that has been working for decades to do even longer to do systems change work. These practices can support, I think, the intentions that systems change has. And vice versa, we can then also bring in and connect and bridge systems practice to feminist work. And one of those ways is accessing resources, because we often find that there are limited resources, a dearth of resources and funding, and that feminist work is often marginalized, and yet and there's a lot of interest in systems change. So it's an opportunity for leverage.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. Very inspiring, because I totally agree with you. Kind of, if there's inherent dominance and violence in a system, trying to do system change work without acknowledging that can only be futile. And feminist practices have a lot of know-how and learning over the last decades about how to unearth these dynamics, reveal them, and also let healing begin for all actors. So I think you really spotted a missing link in our way of thinking, and it can change fundamentally both fields. Tariq, I want to turn to you. When I first proposed you this topic, you said you were triggered by it, and you said you found it triggering, both intellectually and emotionally. So I want to ask you, why is that? What was the tension there? And also ask you the same question: what can the queer movement teach us about system change?
Thank you, Zainab. And I mean, maybe the word triggering is a little bit hard, but I am certainly bothered by it. I largely agree with Tatiana that if you're going to approach a system without figuring out or having what you call a critical power analysis, you are fundamentally misdiagnosing the problem in that system. One of the things that has been going
Okay, can the other panelists hear Tariq, or is it just me? Lebanon and Beirut have been having quite a lot of power cuts in the past week to 10 days. So I know Tariq is ready with all sorts of backup and batteries, and I hope he will make his way back to our panel. Tariq, are you there? Okay, we'll just hope he makes it back, and we will hear why he's bothered by this issue and what he proposes we change. In the meanwhile, Aditi, I want to turn to you. So you're doing frontline work in the field every day and empowering girls in rural India through mentorship programs and really shifting roles traditional roles is very central to your work. So I wanted to ask you, what is your frontline field work teaching you about system change, or can teach us about system change?
Thanks for that question. I think that is very essential to recognize, because just as a young change maker or a young person working in a small town herself, I think it's very essential that you recognize what's the power of system changes, especially in rural backgrounds and countries like India, where there's still a lot of development going on for gender equity, for women empowerment, for leadership and representation, and a lot more that's out there. I think how system change plays a role during the frontline work is it starts from one actor, that is the girl herself whom we are mentoring, and that goes on to build an entire circle of how they go on shifting mindset of people around them. It starts with you mentoring that one girl who goes on to see herself beyond the power she thinks she carries. And then you go on to just make her realize how there's a world out there that's waiting for her arrival. And there are many things that she could do and potentially be as a woman, as a girl, even if she's living in rural India or if she's not coming from the most privileged background that's out there. So I think system change for me in my work starts from changing the mindset of one girl, how she perceives herself, even if her parents or her teachers are not seeing her that way, and then taking that power forward to change how the society sees her as well. So when we talk about women getting into leadership spaces or women representing themselves in politics or maybe boardrooms or policy making or any government administrative services, I think it all starts from what kind of resources are we providing them, what kind of trust are we building with them, or just simply how we are looking at them as leaders or as a future that we would be following soon enough, or as a generation that would eventually grow up in a very democratic society of its own, right? So I think it's even more important to give them the rights that they deserve and make them recognize why they deserve them and how much power do they hold within themselves. So I think for me, system change comes down to changing one perspective. And I think through my work, it has also been a huge sense of realization for me. We have this 11-year-old mentee whom we teach English to, and she's such passionate about learning English that she would go back to her village, and when she would have no one around to speak English to, she would just simply teach it to her mother. And that's what I mean when we go on to recognize, when you go on to help somebody recognize their power and they go on to just multiply it within their surroundings and their environment. So I think system change starts from a very root level of how society sees each other, how the stakeholders sees themselves, and how do they take their power ahead of creating change either in society or just within themselves.
Aditi, thank you for that. And, highlighting oftentimes when we talk about system change, we talk about changing existing roles or introducing new roles, but even stakeholders being able to imagine new roles for themselves and how contagious it becomes once this imagination is possible. So thank you for sharing about that. Actually, I wanted to ask an op question. Okay, there's Tariq, you're back. Give us a sign if you're back.
Yeah, sorry, I had an internet cut. I'm back, thank you.
Okay, then before we go any further in the panel discussion, I wanted to ask you my initial question, kind of what is bothering you about this relationship between kind of bridging the queer movement and system change learnings? What is the tension there, in your opinion?
So I was largely agreeing with my colleague Tatiana that approaching systems change without a critical power analysis is really fundamentally misdiagnosing a system. And we in the queer movement, and I'm here speaking particularly from a global South perspective, had always sort of operated on the assumption that one needs to build power in order to oppose power. And that is somewhat a binary that needs to exist in order for you to get anywhere. When in fact, when you're looking at systems change, you have to, sort of the realization that we came to was predicated upon the idea that there is no such thing as a broken system that building power will fix. Systems are set up precisely the way they are to deliver precisely the results that they're delivering. And they unfortunately deliver results mostly to a few at the expense of the many. So thinking of a system as broken that you need to fix it is another misdiagnosis in terms of how do you want to shift, because it's not just about shifting power from where it purposefully is to where it purposefully isn't. You also need to talk about shifting something a lot more difficult, which is values, because the idea that it's just you and the adversary that are somehow doing this tug of war in the system is quite frankly not true. There are multiple other factions that influence the ebb and flow and how the cogs in this system work. And most of the time, they're either left without being challenged, without being mobilized, without being intervened in. And therefore, you find yourself being stuck doing work for decades and not understanding why you're not progressing forward. So one of the things that trigger me is particularly how that understanding seems to intersect with the idea of being radical and of radicalism. For me, being radical means taking a radical action, which anybody is capable of in order to prioritize solving the public problem. When radicalism becomes an aspect of your identity, when it comes something that is ubiquitous, whereby this is your only approach to solving the public problem, that when you're, in my experience, what you're probably doing is prioritizing, exonerating your own outrage at the expense of solving the public problem. Because what shifts the system might not be applying pressure where you want to apply pressure. It might be exactly the opposite to that in order to move it. And so really successfully diagnosing where do you intervene and precisely how power works across all of the axes of the system is incredibly important.
Thank you, Tariq, for this new depth. And I also wanted to ask you kind of this, the idea of what's going to shift the system, like the intervention that's going to shift the system may not be what you want to do. And it might be something that's counterintuitive. And I know you work with introducing kind of new roles into the system you work in. And I know you had to question your instincts and how to go about these issues. So what does that look like in your day-to-day work? Kind of this going against your wish to do things a certain way, of the people you choose to involve, and so on.
Well, I can give you a concrete example of how that manifests in our work. So for the longest time, I've been trying to work with moms of queer people in order to mobilize them as a political force, precisely to counterbalance the influence that religious leaders and political leaders and psychiatrists and other people who pathologize queer people do have in the public discourse. Because we felt that a mother's word and a mother's authority can counterbalance all of that damage and all of that harm. And I couldn't have been more wrong, because what I was trying to do was basically build power to oppose power in a binary way, and not understand that, first of all, people don't resist change, people resist loss. And one of the things that contributed to the misdiagnosis of the system is that whether you like it or not, whether it's fair or not, whether you should act upon it or not, queer people represent a certain sense of loss to other parts of the system that don't quite understand, that don't have the familiarity or haven't had the exposure. And a key to diagnosing what that loss, figuring out what that loss is a key in order to mobilize them. And when it came to moms, the reason why it hadn't worked for so long is because we were precisely looking at these women as extensions of their children. We were looking at them as moms. We weren't looking at them as women. We weren't creating spaces for individuals that have experienced their own loss, for individuals that also are coming out, in order to process and to build their power that way. But what we were trying to do was just basically mobilize a group of people according to what we wanted to do, not what the system needed in order to shift. Once we changed that, once the activists sort of stepped out and moms were allowed to come in and create their own spaces of healing, of dialogue as women, not as moms, that's when we were able to actually mobilize a completely new, powerful part of the system that had been completely, ignored for a very, very long time and misused. And what we're seeing now, sort of the added, sort of the snowball effect of how many people are joining this group, how many people are joining this movement without a single queer activist in the room, is what made all the difference.
Thank you, Tarek, for this learning kind of. Yeah, in system change work, often actors are very one-dimensional, like organized along an identity that can be instrumentalized sometimes, as these are the moms of queer people and they can become activists kind of equation. But I think this realization is very deep that these individuals are there in a system also experiencing a loss, maybe a loss of a future traditional wedding or having grandchildren someday or whatever it is in their story. And I think you and your organization, Helem, your ability to step away from instrumentalizing them and giving them space. And can you give us an example, like what is happening when you do this? How is it different?
So I can give you a concrete example. When we're talking about sort of bringing new actors into a system for the first time, one of the things that people tend to do at the beginning is talk and not listen. One of the things that people that to do is and by which fail to diagnose exactly what is happening. So. We had one case in which a mom was very protective, very supportive of their child. But again, because we could only see her as a mom, we failed to understand that the reason why she hasn't been supportive and loving is because for her, acknowledging it means risking other people in the family knowing, particularly the husband and the father, which would put the queer child at risk. These were issues that we as queer activists that are so used to centralizing ourselves in our own story were completely oblivious to. But they were exerting enormous amount of influence on our lives without us even knowing that they were there. So the multiplicity of actors that are coming in and giving and are allowed space to speak, are allowed space to express, and where you have to swallow a pill and you have to listen, is what has really shifted everything very, very dramatically. And the same can hold true for many other groups of people. It can hold true for religious leaders. It can hold true for educators. It can hold true for many people that had been traditionally thought of as adversaries, but that's because the way of engaging them wasn't what we were used to, wasn't what traditionally activists should do. So that was a very powerful lesson that we learned.
Thank you for sharing, Tarek. And I heard you talk about space, and I want to move and talk a little bit about resources. And I think space is definitely a resource and value kind of. Often we think about filling spaces and, exerting things into systems, but I know our speakers have a lot to share on this as well, kind of. How do you shift resources, shift values towards system change? And I will ask Aditi specifically about this giving space as a resource issue. So Aditi, maybe you can tell us kind of in your work, how are you trying to shift resources and value towards a more system change approach?
Absolutely. I think when we talk about having the right set of resources for every young rural girl out there, or every girl or woman growing up in a marginalized community, I think what we also refer to is having space as one of a very, very essential resource, because it's not just about providing monetary benefits or monetary resources in any terms, but it's also more so about how are you taking care of their emotional well-being, how are you taking care of their values that they're growing up with, or how well are you trying to sort of not align the roots of patriarchy or the hierarchical structure that has been gone into the society so far for them, and what they have grown up seeing all along. How are you going to create a mindset change with that, with providing them the right set of resources? So also, while providing a safe space, providing a space, or providing a set of values that actually make them believe in themselves is essential. I think it also plays a major role in how we are going on to include the right set of mentors for them. What sort of mentorship are they getting from their educational hubs, or what sort of mentorship that they are getting from their guardians or parents, or also about like, even in terms of mentorship, how are they aligning themselves with the values of their own mentors, or how are they recognizing their own powers through this relationship? I think that all plays a huge role when we talk about resources in a whole. And what also comes into a major part of creating system change through resources is just recognizing the need of person, going beyond the sense of empathy and getting yourself in a situation where you could actually understand what this person could be needing, and just extending the resource to them, even if it's monetary, even if it's value relevant, even if it's relevant to space. How are you going to make sure that your mentee is in the right emotional well-being? How are you going to make sure that your mentee is the right state of mind to learn something new while you are on it to make them learn? So I think just as Tariq mentioned in his conversation, that values as a whole plays a huge role when we talk about system change, because once you go on to make them believe in their power, it's the power that goes on to multiplies within every space that they step into. So even in my own work, when we go on round and work with rural girls, provide them mentorship, I think the first thing that we mainly recognize is what is lacking, not in monetary terms of educational experiences, but what is essentially lacking in emotional well-being mainly. Because when you put light on that, you go on to realize that it's not just about, providing the right set of curriculum for them to learn from, providing the right set of language curriculum or educational curriculum, but it's also about how you are leading them, or how you are bringing them into a space where they are comfortable sharing their ambitions, sharing their ideas, bring in trust with yourself, because you do not identify as one, right? There's a huge gap of privilege existing between both the groups. And when there's a huge gap of privilege, I think people from marginalized community definitely needs a higher spotlight. They definitely need to be highlighted in terms of spaces that they are in, because they are the people who understand their struggles deeply. I, as a mentor to a rural girl, cannot go on to understand her experiences or struggles as deeply as she herself does, because there's a huge value gap again while we have grown up. But it's about recognizing what's the best that you can go on to provide while you're working in a system that has a huge requirement of it, and how well you are benefiting it with your own resources or values, or how you're just simply creating a space for them to demand their rights or just to fight for them simply.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for reminding us, kind of, when we say resource, it's not necessarily monetary resources, but there's so much more possibility out there. Tatiana, I wanted to turn to you. I know you're thinking and working a lot on how to let's say, resource the work differently, as it should be. Kind of, what is the shift that's needed to be done in how we resource this kind of work, and where do you see hope? Where do you see good practices?
Lovely, thank you. Maybe just to begin with, a trend I think that is fair, and we hear in the other panelists, is often the work that's happening, or the leadership that has the most insight and the most kind of innovation and perspective about systems change is perspective that comes from the margins and from people who are living and impacted by harmful systems kind of firsthand. And so first and foremost, I think recognizing that shifting resources and starting from this perspective, centering this perspective is critical and important. And in the work that I do, kind of so I'm based in Canada, in the West, and systems change has kind of been born, this new field, this new field of systems change has been born in a very Western and white academic kind of context, which is highly privileged. And so that a trend that I see is often systems initiatives are being born and kind of led from the center of that system, which we could call kind of the dominant system. So a big question is, how can you shift a system when you're starting from the center of that system of dominance and cultures that are dominant in the norms. So by shifting resources intentionally, by starting systems work, by centering communities who are living and experiencing harmful systems is critical and important. And the second thing I would say is that we see in kind of feminist work, which cuts across many issues, right? There's feminist work cuts across all the SDGs, right? When you look at actually number 5 SDG, you see the whole circle of SDGs represented in kind of the women's gender issues. And because there's a lack of resources and funding, often grassroots work is in kind of crisis management mode, which is highly stressful. It doesn't allow people to get their heads above water. They're just dealing with like frontline crisis. Like we see this in, for example, around violence against women. And there's a lack of resources supporting those frontline workers. And so if you come to the table and say, well, let's think about systems change, it can piss people off, I would say. And so one of the things we see in systems practice is that we are working and creating context to work across difference. And this is important and valuable. And we need to create the space for that. And as Tarek was saying, we need spaciousness and time to build and deepen relationships across diverse actors in the system. And that's counterculture in a Western context where everything is fast, where we're looking for outcomes, we want impact, we want measurement. We don't have time. People are burning out at high rates in this work. And so resourcing ecosystem work for feminist, gender, intersectional systems change is really important, but it isn't the top priority on the list. We don't see that happening, and not only that, when we do create these spaces, we're working at a cultural level. So in systems practice, we need to start from how am I located in the system? How am I privileged? How am I challenged? How am I located in this work? And we need to create the opportunities for people to be connecting their own kind of selves into the space and into the work. And when we do that, what we see emerge is a culture of care and a recognition that we can't heal and fix, as Tarek was saying, fix systems without kind of healing the self. So the work around healing self is connected to healing systems, and we need spaciousness for that. So resourcing is a really complex issue, and it's very practical when it comes to funding and prioritizing these issues and supporting them powerfully. We see some innovative work happening in this way. The Equity Fund is happening in this way. And in the work that we do at ecosystem levels, we see collaboratives emerging out of working together when they're coming up against funding barriers to find new ways to leverage resources, to bypass kind of funding barriers. So that's hopeful. But I do think centering this work and recognizing the interconnectivity to all the issues that we're talking about is key. And it's interesting, even with Tarek, that the mothers were kind of an important intervention in the system.
Thank you, Tatiana. I really love how you describe it as kind of, like we can slow down, like this work is worth slowing down for or creating space for, and kind of the funders in the field kind of realizing this. You mentioned the Equity Fund in Canada. I also remember you mentioning things like resources for sabbaticals for people who are at the front line. I mean, why is a sabbatical so out of question, and why do we wait till these people burn out? Or funding that simply keeps the lights on, kind of. So this kind of, I think it's really important to have ambassadors like you voice these needs that you are seeing. On the resources, Tarek, I wanted to turn to you. So when we say resources, especially, we often think, what do we add to the system? And you mentioned sometimes for resources to emerge, you need to abandon things in a system so that other resources can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's a very apt segue from what Tatiana just said, which I agree with completely, that sometimes the most profound change happens not in like some sort of thunderous sort of lightning change. It's in very somber, quiet moments of reflection. And it's precisely around not exactly what you have gained, but what you have let go of. To go back to the example that you said, Zainab, before on so many of these moms feeling the loss connected to them not being able to see their children get married, or in their minds not to see them to see themselves as grandmothers, etc., whatever it is. What the real systems change and the real change that has happened is when many of these moms realize that they don't necessarily have to give up the wedding or the kids or the family life. What they are giving up is one very small thing, that is outdated, that is harmful, that is destroying the relationship with the people that they love, and they're keeping what matters. And letting that go, that values shift, is incredibly difficult. And it's very difficult for us to understand because many people, often center their own pain, their own suffering. It's very difficult for them to empathize with other people that they perceive to have more power than them, in this case, a parent. So removing yourself from the equation and understanding that you need space and time and healing and empathy and community in order for this difficult work to happen. Changing values is a very difficult process. Human beings need one another and need support to do it. And so empathy becomes not just something that is desirable, it becomes a strategic imperative to do this work. I think Aditi also spoke about this very eloquently, and I completely agree. It becomes a necessary part of this formula, or else you're not going to get anywhere. And so for us, this particular resource sort of is then created from the ether, But it's fundamentally, it's very paradoxical how losing something is a resource for you in order to continue the push forward for the system to shift.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the rainbow flag changing so much over the years in relation to this. Is this a success of the queer movement's ability to abandon something that creates room for new things to emerge? What is your take on that?
Well, queer people also have to abandon something. Everybody in the system at some point needs to let go of something for the system to shift. And in many ways, let me just say that I personally don't like flags. I think they're problematic symbols just in general. However, with the rainbow flag, one thing that I realize is that symbols, if they don't evolve, they die or they become problematic. And one of the things that has happened with the rainbow flag recently is that, a few years ago, the two colors symbolizing the trans movement were added, which was somehow a sort of a reconfirmation of the importance of identity to our work, particularly gender identity. And trans individuals are the heart and soul of the LGBTQ rights movement and the queer movement in the world. But then two more colors were added, which were black and brown, almost prophetically on the other side of the flag. And I think that was a sort of, at first, just an attempt to say that we're intersectional without understanding what that actually means and what a massive responsibility intersectionality is. You can't just add these two colors and expect that it's just one facet of identity. You have opened up the floodgates for so much complexity to come into this space. So almost as one is saying, identity is important, it's central, you can't be without it, but you cannot allow it to be the first all and all dynamic with which this movement revolves around. Because any identity, I don't care how marginalized it is, I don't care how peripheral it might be in a system, has the potential to become oppressive. If it's the only thing, if it's the only issue that we talk about. You can't just talk about identity. You have to talk about wealth. You have to talk about experience. You have to talk about common sort of communities coming together and experiencing something that traverses identity. There's multiple Venn diagrams here that cannot just be cannot be ignored if you're changing systems. So one of the things that I'm quite unpopular in saying is that you do realize that what is so important, what we fight for so long, which is our identity, might be precisely the thing that we need to at least partially let go of in order for the system to shift. And that is a fundamentally devastating thing for people at the receiving end of power to understand and to realize and to work through. It's not easy. And this is where I think Tatiana was spot on talking about privilege and talking about how does one think about systems change without factoring in this, the power imbalance that has created trauma. People aren't coming just from a place of discomfort. They're coming from trauma. And you're asking them to do, you're asking someone who is oppressed to lead themselves and the oppressor out of the swamp of oppression. If you're going to ask someone that, you'd better give them the resources to do it.
Thank you so much. We are almost out of time, but I really need to ask you three for a quick answer to this last question. As people, you work on at the intersection of system change work and deep trauma-related, healing-related work as well. And we often say, you need to put the oxygen mask first so you can help others. So what would be your advice to yourself, for example, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, if you could tell yourself one sentence that you know now, what would that be?
I'll jump in. I think, Tarek, I loved what you shared in terms of identity, and I think just a reflection around part of, I think that the locating, how we are located in the work is really important to be able to be conscious of and to constantly create the opportunities for learning about. And that identity politics can become very stuck. It kind of solidifies people in a way that doesn't allow us to kind of create new connections that might allow us to see new ways forward. So it's a fine balance. And I think in the feminist movement, there's been a lot of really important learning around intersectionality. But I would say most importantly, the learning that I've done in this work happened mostly when I stepped out of my organization and freed myself from the actual definition and mandates and sustainability issues. And so I think the being human and doing the work as really grounding in our humanity and doing the healing work for ourselves in relationship to people and to the planet and to the trees and the animals is really powerful. And that in this space, which is much less tangible, we can emerge communities of care and support kind of collective healing. That is, I think, really important in terms of shifting systems. But it's less, you can't touch it, you can't measure it. So,
Tatiana,
and I do.
You.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I cut you through. Please finish.
I also just wanted to say, in that sense, that I think there's also this new trend around healing and collective healing. And I think there's a huge responsibility in doing that and a huge risk of thinking one might be able to step in and hold a space like that and not necessarily have the accountability and responsibility to do so well without re-traumatizing people. So I think there's a lot there's a lot to draw on. There's a lot of really good experience in feminist spaces and other spaces that have done this type of work well. And so I think the systems field can also turn and look to others in terms of the learning, which I think is key. There's a lot of ways into systems change. And so I appreciate the perspectives from everyone today.
Perfect. We are out of time, but I want to hear your one sentences. Aditi, what is your one sentence advice to your previous self?
Of course. Yeah, I think it's also the sentence that I actually grew up living in itself. I think since I lacked a mentor myself when I was young, and this is a support system that I've got to build on now, but since it wasn't there before, I think mentorship is something I wanted to pass on for every girl like me, or even, so there's this quote from one of my very favorite feminist author that goes on to say that no woman is free, even if I am free, even though her shadows are very different from my own, although I forgot like what it actually reads light, but that's the meaning of it. And I think the gist of it holds for me is, how do you go on to build a relationship with people around you that you feel very deeply about? You feel deeply in a way that you do not just empathize with them, but you actually got on the field and groundwork and do something about it since you care about it so deeply. So for me, it has always been about relationships. And if there's one thing I would want to pass on to myself again and again over time is, build a relationship with yourself that you'd be proud of 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because that's the relationship you are nurturing with yourself, is something you're going to pass on to other people as well. If you have empathy for yourself, you would be passing on it to other people. If you can go on to recognize your own powers, you'd be able to empower somebody else, not by providing them some service, but just by enabling them to recognize it within themselves. So I think for me, it all comes down to how I see myself, and of course, how much patience I carry in the rising ambitions of the world.
Thank you. Tarek, literally your one sentence, and then we need to beam ourselves to our connecting session.
It is actually one sentence, just to say that it's this work is not about you. In fact, it's not about you doing the work. It's about how you give the work back and how others can do the work. So resist that temptation and don't be afraid to say no.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, Aditi, Tarek. Pleasure to have this conversation with you. Let's carry it on. We have our connecting session happening over Zoom. So this is an open invite to our panelists, to our audience. Let's keep talking about these issues. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I look forward to carrying on this conversation in other venues. Thank you so much.